A name that carried fear. A man with enemies in every shadow. On January 9, 2025, Hawre Sherwani was gunned down in a chilling execution. A fake police car, a sudden stop, a hail of bullets. In just 9 seconds, it was over. But this wasn't just another gangland killing. This was personal. For years, Sherwani built a reputation few dared to challenge. He had power, connections, and a history of violence that made him both respected and feared. But power in the underworld comes at a cost, and for Sherwani, that price was blood. Deadly rivalries, betrayals, revenge. He knew he was a marked man. A $1 million bounty hung over his head. He took precautions, always looking over his shoulder. But in this world, the enemy comes when you least expect it. That night in Caroline Springs, he thought he was being pulled over by police. But the men in that car weren't officers. They were executioners. Their weapons were already raised. Who wanted him dead? A rival gang? An old enemy? Or something bigger? His assassination sent shockwaves through Melbourne's underworld. A crime so precise, so cold, it left more questions than answers. But one thing was certain. This was no random act of violence. Someone planned this. Someone gave the order. And someone, somewhere, is still watching. This is the story of Hawre Sherwani, his life, his crimes, and the final moments that ended it all. If you enjoy deep dives into real-life crime stories, subscribe to the Criminal Files and turn on notifications. We uncover the untold, the hidden, and the most shocking cases from around the world. He was born into uncertainty. He died in violence. But in between, Hawre Sherwani carved a path few could survive. His story was one of power, loyalty, and calculated brutality. A man who knew no fear, showed no mercy, and made enemies he could never outrun. But how did he get here? How did a young refugee boy transform into one of the most feared figures in Melbourne's criminal underworld? Hawre Sherwani's story didn't begin in Australia. He was born in northern Iraq, a place where survival was a daily struggle. His early years were shaped by conflict, displacement, and instability. His family, searching for safety, fled to Australia when he was just a child. They left behind war zones and refugee camps, hoping for a fresh start, a better life. But life in a new country is never that simple. The promise of peace didn't erase the struggle of fitting in. Hawre grew up in Melbourne's northern suburbs, a place where opportunity coexisted with crime. It was a world where respect wasn't given, it was earned, taken, or stolen. Did he ever really have a choice? By his teenage years, Sherwani wasn't just another immigrant kid trying to find his way. He had already made his choice. The streets became his battleground. He wasn't interested in school, in rules, in an ordinary life. He wanted power. And in Melbourne, power belonged to the underworld. He found his place among those who lived by violence and thrived on fear. By his late teens, his name was already spoken in whispers. A reputation for quick tempers, heavy fists, and zero hesitation. The gangs noticed. Sherwani wasn't just drawn to street crime. He wanted something bigger. And he found it with the Comanchero Motorcycle Club. The Comancheros weren't just any gang. They were one of Australia's most notorious outlaw motorcycle clubs. Feared, organized, and deeply embedded in Melbourne's criminal landscape. This wasn't just about crime. It was a way of life. Sherwani earned his place fast. His reckless aggression and willingness to do what others wouldn't made him valuable. The Comancheros had a reputation to protect, and so did he. They gave him a name, Harry the KO, because when he hit, you didn't get back up. By then, his transformation was complete. The quiet boy who arrived from Iraq was gone. In his place stood a man who lived by the code of violence. Reputations are built on moments. And in 2014, Hawre Sherwani cemented his. The target was a former Comanchero member, a man who had crossed the wrong people. The underworld doesn't forgive, and in Melbourne's gang culture, betrayal is answered with blood. It happened at a smash repair shop in Collingwood, a place meant for fixing cars, not breaking bones. But that night, it became a battleground. The entire attack was caught on CCTV. The footage later used in court captured everything in brutal clarity. Sherwani and his associate entered without hesitation. They knew their orders. No talking, no warnings, just punishment. The victim never stood a chance. A fist to the face, a knee to the ribs, boots crushing bone. The man collapsed, but the beating continued. They broke his arms, they shattered his face. Every hit sent a message. This is what happens when you cross the wrong people. The police who later watched the footage called it one of the most violent assaults they'd ever seen. But in the underworld, it was just another job. Sherwani was arrested, charged, and sentenced. 4 years behind bars. But for a man like him, prison wasn't a punishment. It was training. Did he regret it? Did he think about the life he could have chosen? If he did, he never showed it. The world outside was waiting. His name carried weight, but so did his enemies. When he walked out of that prison cell, he wasn't just another criminal. He was a man with a past that was catching up to him, and he was about to learn a lesson that every gangster eventually faces. When you live by violence, it always comes back for you. But did he see it coming? Or did he believe he was untouchable? This was just the beginning. His story wasn't over, but the countdown to his final moment had already begun. Hawre Sherwani had always been a man who made enemies easily. Some were small-time rivals, others were dangerous men with long memories. By the time he walked out of prison in 2015, the streets of Melbourne had changed. But the rules remained the same: power, loyalty, and retribution. For a man like Sherwani, staying out of trouble was never an option. And soon, blood would be spilled again. October 27, 2015. A quiet night in Thomastown, Melbourne. A family asleep in their home. Then, the sound of gunfire. Bullets tore through the walls, shattering windows, ripping through furniture. But the real damage was done inside. In one of the bedrooms, 54-year-old Rashad Adra lay in bed, unaware of the danger outside. One of the bullets found him before he ever had a chance to react. A father, a hard-working man with no criminal ties, shot dead in his sleep. He wasn't the only victim. In the next room, his 4-year-old son, Kareem, was also hit. The child survived, but barely. His tiny body carried the scars of a crime he was never meant to be a part of. Or was he? At first, investigators believed this was a random act of violence. But in Melbourne's criminal underworld, nothing is random. So who was the real target? The streets whispered one name: Hawre Sherwani. Some believed he had ordered the hit. Others thought he was connected, but from a distance. But the police, they had nothing solid. No witnesses, no evidence. And Sherwani? He never answered questions. Because in his world, silence was survival. A year later, another name entered the picture. One that would change the course of Sherwani's life forever. Ahmed Al-Hamza. At just 18 years old, he was already making waves in Melbourne's Middle Eastern organized crime scene. A man with connections, ambition, and a reputation that was growing as fast as his influence. But influence in the underworld comes with risk, and someone wanted him gone. On a cold evening in 2016, a single gunshot rang out near the Al Diwan Cafe in Campbellfield. Al-Hamza was hit in the leg, not a fatal wound, but a clear warning. Someone had just tried to take him off the board. And the streets? They were whispering again. Sherwani, the same man who had walked free after the 2015 drive-by, was now being linked to another attack. But this wasn't just any shooting. This was an act that would have consequences years later. Because Ahmed Al-Hamza was no ordinary target. At 18, he was just a rising figure. But years later, he would become something far more dangerous. A Dubai-based crime boss with international reach, wealth, and the power to destroy anyone who crossed him, including the man who tried to kill him, including Hawre Sherwani. Sherwani wasn't afraid of making enemies, but was he prepared for the ones he had? The Comancheros still had unfinished business. Families torn apart by violence wanted justice. Rival gangs were waiting for their moment. And now, an ambitious crime lord had a score to settle. The world around him was closing in. But Sherwani? He kept moving forward, reckless, unstoppable, blind to the dangers creeping in closer. The bullet that missed Al-Hamza in 2016, it had set a chain of events in motion. One that would lead to a fake police car, 28 bullets, and a desperate man bleeding in the streets of Caroline Springs. Did Sherwani ever realize his past was catching up to him? Or did he think he could outrun it? One thing was clear. He was running out of time. In the world Sherwani inhabited, money was everything. And in 2023, a new fortune was up for grabs. A fortune stained with blood. The streets of Melbourne were no longer just a battleground for petty crime or gang turf wars. They had become the front lines in a violent fight for control over the city's illicit tobacco trade. And Sherwani? He was at the center of it all. Australia's strict tobacco tax laws had created a perfect storm for criminal organizations. High taxes on legal tobacco products sent the price through the roof, forcing everyday smokers to seek cheaper, untaxed alternatives. Criminal gangs, seeing an opportunity, flooded the market with cheap, illegal tobacco, smuggled in from overseas, sold for a significant profit, and carried no legal risks. For criminals, this black market was a gold mine. But competition quickly turned violent. Gangs that had once fought for control over drugs and weapons were now fighting for territory in a new, highly profitable arena, the tobacco trade. And when you're in the business of smuggling, intimidation is key. Sherwani's ties to this underground world were deep. His connections within Melbourne's organized crime scene, coupled with his ties to the Comanchero Motorcycle Club, made him a key player in the illicit tobacco trade. But the deeper he got, the darker the game became. In the world of smuggled goods, the stakes were high and the risks were higher. One wrong move and it could all come crashing down. Yet Sherwani, like a seasoned gambler, bet his life on the game. He wasn't just involved. He was a driving force behind the operations, making deals, smuggling shipments, and expanding his influence across Melbourne. But others wanted in. And when the money flows like this, there's always someone ready to take it from you. By 2023, the violence was unmistakable. The Melbourne tobacco wars had erupted into a full-scale conflict, with gang members using firebombs, shootings, and arson to settle scores and eliminate competition. Sherwani was at the center of the storm, his name a target for rival factions, and his life marked by constant threats. That year alone, Melbourne would see a wave of brutality that would change the criminal landscape forever. Sherwani's world was about to turn even more dangerous. In June 2023, his former home in Caroline Springs was firebombed. Not once, but 3 separate times. The attacks were a direct message: get out or die trying. Each explosion sent flames licking the sky. Each fire obliterated memories, belongings, and security. But for Sherwani, it wasn't just his house that was burning. It was his entire world. Who was behind these attacks? Some believed it was a rival group trying to send a message, the message being that Sherwani was a dead man walking. But Sherwani wasn't one to back down. He took the blows and survived. But his enemies? They didn't stop. In October 2023, the violence reached its horrifying peak. A close associate of Sherwani, Robert Issa, was brutally murdered in a drive-by shooting. This wasn't just any random attack. It was calculated, cold, and precise. The kind of execution that left no room for doubt. This was payback. Issa, like Sherwani, was known to be connected to Melbourne's most dangerous circles. But unlike Sherwani, he didn't have the same protection. His death was a stark reminder that in this world, loyalty meant little. Who ordered the hit? Was it a rival gang seeking revenge for a firebombing? Or was it a bigger force, a new threat Sherwani had failed to see? As Issa's body lay lifeless, the underworld braced for the fallout. The stakes were rising. And for Sherwani, the walls were closing in. With Issa's murder, things had taken a darker turn. Sherwani's name was being spoken in hushed tones across the criminal world, and it wasn't with respect. The rivals who had once feared him were now seeing an opportunity, a chance to rid themselves of the thorn in their side. And to sweeten the deal, a bounty of $1 million was placed on his head. $1 million. For most, this would be the end. The reward for turning in a criminal mastermind like Sherwani was enough to break anyone's loyalty. But Sherwani? He didn't flinch. He didn't run. Instead, he went underground, took even more precautions, and prepared for the inevitable storm to hit. Who could he trust now? His enemies were closing in, his former allies slipping away. He had become a marked man in the most literal sense. But would this mark be his undoing? Or was it a reminder that for men like him, death is just another risk? The stage was set. The battle for control over Melbourne's most lucrative crime business was about to reach its final act. And Sherwani? He was in the eye of the storm. But would he survive long enough to see the end? It was a cold, quiet night in Caroline Springs, Melbourne. A January evening 2025, one that would forever be etched in the city's criminal history. But in the hours before the attack, no one could have foreseen the twist of fate that would soon unfold. Hawre Sherwani had lived his entire life running from death. Yet on that night, it would find him. Sherwani was no stranger to danger. Every day he spent breathing, walking, and moving through Melbourne's gang-infested streets was another roll of the dice. He knew he was being hunted. But on the night of January 9th, the game changed. A Volkswagen Tiguan, a model commonly used by Victoria police, cruised slowly down the road. In the driver's seat, two men dressed in police uniforms. Flashing their lights, they pulled up behind Sherwani's Volkswagen Golf. A routine stop? For someone like Sherwani, a man used to the threat of being pulled over by police, it was nothing more than another interruption. But it wasn't the police. It was an ambush. In that split second, when Sherwani's vehicle came to a halt, everything changed. The two hitmen, disguised as law enforcement, didn't hesitate. They had waited, planned. Sherwani, caught completely off guard, never saw it coming. The first shot rang out, followed by a hail of bullets. In 9 seconds, 28 rounds were fired, point-blank range. Boom, boom, boom. It was a massacre. Sherwani, struck multiple times, could barely comprehend what was happening as he slumped in his seat, the blood pooling beneath him. This wasn't just a hit. This was a message. But it wasn't enough to kill him. Despite the onslaught, Sherwani survived. His instincts kicked in. He staggered out of the car, his body barely holding together, but his mind sharp with the one thought that kept him alive for so long: escape. With blood seeping from his wounds, he ran. His legs shaking, his breath coming in sharp gasps, he stumbled down the street, his vision blurred, his world spinning. He was desperate. He reached a nearby house, pounding on the door in frantic desperation. "I've been shot. Please help me." A local resident later described seeing him as he approached the door. He looked drunk, stumbling, and bleeding out, barely able to stand. Sherwani's condition was rapidly deteriorating. His body, once powerful, now betrayed him. The man who had commanded fear was now nothing more than a dying fugitive. As the resident opened the door, they saw the grim reality. A man desperate for survival. A man who had lived a life of violence, now helpless, and pleading for a second chance. He could barely hold himself up, each breath becoming harder. This wasn't the warrior of Melbourne's underworld, but a man caught in the snare of his own past. Despite their efforts to help, Sherwani's time was running out. The blood loss was too great and the wounds too severe. The man who had spent years being hunted by others was now facing the consequences of his own violent journey. It had all come full circle. But Sherwani's death wasn't the only tragedy that night. A stray bullet from the attack had pierced the wall of a nearby home. Inside, a 15-year-old boy slept soundly in his room, unaware of the danger that was just inches away from claiming his life. The bullet lodged into the boy's mattress. Had he been in his bed, he would have been struck, possibly fatally. Was this just a coincidence? Or was it yet another reminder of the chaos that had consumed Melbourne's criminal underworld? The collateral damage of a world ruled by violence and fear. Sherwani was rushed to the hospital, but by the time he arrived, it was too late. The damage was too great. The man who had ruled the streets, who had made a name for himself in blood, was now nothing more than a tragic memory. His death marked the end of an era. But the question remained: who had ordered his death? Who stood to gain from the loss of such a notorious figure? And in the underworld, what would come next? The power vacuum Sherwani left behind would spark new rivalries, new alliances, and more bloodshed. Was this the end for Sherwani, or was it just the beginning of an even more dangerous chapter in Melbourne's underworld? Sherwani had paid the ultimate price for his violent life, but in this world, death doesn't close the book. It only opens a new one. Who would take his place, and who would fill the gap left by his death? The answers were yet to come. But in the underworld, one thing is certain: it's never over. The dust settled on the streets of Caroline Springs, but in the aftermath of Hawre Sherwani's brutal assassination, a new set of questions emerged. Questions no one could easily answer. As Melbourne's criminal underworld reeled from the news of Sherwani's death, the police investigation began to unravel. But for every lead, there were more dead ends, and for every piece of evidence, there was a mountain of silence. Sherwani had lived a life surrounded by enemies, and his death? It only deepened the mystery. When law enforcement arrived at the scene of the assassination, the Volkswagen Tiguan, the fake police car used in the hit, had already been abandoned and torched, burned beyond recognition, deliberately destroyed to eliminate any trace of the killers. The getaway vehicle had been set on fire only minutes after Sherwani's execution, erasing all valuable forensic evidence. The car that had been used to trap him was now nothing more than a charred wreck, offering no clues, no fingerprints, no DNA. Yet the killers knew the importance of leaving no trace. But that didn't mean there were no leads. The streets of Melbourne, already thick with violence, became even more suffocating after Sherwani's death. For those who had witnessed the hit, there was only one thing more dangerous than speaking up: the fear of retaliation. The underworld had its rules, its code, and those who lived by it never spoke to the police. Ever. Despite the bloody spectacle on the streets and the lives affected, no one came forward. Not a single witness was willing to break the wall of silence that kept them safe, at least for now. Reprisal was swift, and anyone with knowledge of the hit knew that speaking out would mean certain death. The fear was palpable. But was that silence just a cover for something deeper? Something more sinister? Amid the chaos, the police did recover evidence, but it didn't give them much to work with. A European-made semi-automatic pistol was found at the scene. It was high-powered, precise, and designed for efficiency, a weapon often favored by professional hitmen. The gun was now being forensically analyzed, but would it reveal anything? Could the ballistics of this firearm link it to previous shootings or criminal operations? Or was it a weapon used by a well-prepared assassin who knew how to clean up after themselves? As the forensic team worked tirelessly, one question loomed. Who was the gun really meant for? Was it Sherwani, or was he simply a casualty of someone else's war? Sherwani's death, calculated and executed with precision, could have come from anyone in his world. He had so many enemies, who stood to benefit most from his sudden violent end. First, there were his rivals in the tobacco wars. For years, Sherwani had been a key figure in Melbourne's illicit tobacco trade, a market worth millions. As the wars over smuggled tobacco reached their bloodiest peak, there were many who wanted to take Sherwani out of the picture. His death could have been the ultimate business move, a way to eliminate a competitor and control a larger share of the market. But was that it? Was it just business? Or was there something more personal at play? Another theory circled through the underworld, the involvement of Ahmed Al-Hamza. Sherwani and Al-Hamza had crossed paths before. In 2016, Sherwani had been linked to a shooting that left Al-Hamza, the rising Middle Eastern crime figure, wounded. Although Sherwani had never been charged, rumors swirled that this assault had left a lingering vendetta, one that Sherwani could never have imagined. In the years that followed, Al-Hamza had grown into a formidable crime lord, a man whose influence spanned continents, from Melbourne to Dubai. With power came ruthlessness, and with ruthlessness came revenge. Had Al-Hamza placed a target on Sherwani's back, waiting for the perfect moment to settle the score? Could it be that the assassin's European pistol was a tool of Al-Hamza's syndicate, a message not just to Sherwani, but to anyone who stood in his way? But then, there was the possibility of something far more complex, a power play within the underworld. Sherwani's death could have been the result of a larger struggle for dominance, one involving shifting alliances, old grudges, and powerful figures who needed Sherwani out of the way for their own personal gain. With Sherwani's violent end, The criminal landscape was left wide open. Who would rise to take his place? And who was behind the scenes, orchestrating this series of events to manipulate the power vacuum left in Sherwani's wake? Was it someone who stood to gain from his death, not just financially, but by controlling the tobacco trade, the streets, and the underworld itself? As the investigation deepened, one chilling question began to haunt the detectives. Is the killer still out there? The underworld is built on fear, secrecy, and unseen hands pulling the strings. Was the murderer someone Sherwani knew, or a hired gun with no ties to the chaos? Was this a one-time hit or a prelude to more violence to come? Who could have carried out such a calculated attack? And more importantly, who would benefit the most from Sherwani's death? Sherwani's murder left more questions than answers, and as the investigation continued, the criminal world buzzed with whispers of new players moving in, new power struggles, and the promise of more bloodshed. His death, though final for him, was just the beginning of a new, deadly chapter for Melbourne's underworld. The hunt for answers, for justice, and for retribution had only just begun. The shot that killed Hawre Sherwani rang through Melbourne's criminal underworld, but the echoes of that violence were only just beginning. His death, though swift and brutal, left behind a world on the edge of collapse, a world of uncertainty, fear, and rising tension. In the immediate aftermath of Sherwani's assassination, Melbourne's underworld was plunged into chaos. His death was felt by everyone, from low-level thugs to the most powerful crime lords. The question on everyone's mind wasn't just about who had pulled the trigger, it was who would strike next. Retaliation was inevitable, a code of revenge that ran deep through the veins of organized crime. Sherwani may have been the target, but in the world he lived in, the blood of any victim often summoned a flood of violence in return. Rival gangs, old enemies, and even former allies of Sherwani were now on high alert. Who would step forward to take the mantle of power Sherwani had held? And who would be the next target in the never-ending game of underworld retribution? Would it be a new face, eager to step into Sherwani's shoes? Or would the old guard, those who had lived in the shadows of the man he had become, seek to avenge him? The line between loyalty and betrayal was growing thinner by the second. As Sherwani's enemies prepared for what was coming, the underworld braced itself for a storm. The moment Sherwani's heart stopped beating, a vacuum appeared. In the criminal world, power doesn't just disappear, it gets claimed. Sherwani's rise had been built on violence, intimidation, and brutal efficiency. His absence left a hole so large that anyone with ambition and the right connections could fill it. But who would be the one to step up? Would it be a member of the Comanchero MC, desperate to seize control of the illicit tobacco trade Sherwani had dominated? Perhaps an ambitious member of a rival gang, eager to prove they could take over where Sherwani left off? Or would Al-Hamza's syndicate finally make its move, claiming full control after years of tension? One thing was certain. Whoever moved in to take Sherwani's place would face the same challenges: more bloodshed, more betrayal, and more violence. The city was already on edge, and the war for control would soon spread like wildfire. Who would take the reins of Melbourne's criminal empire? The next chapter of terror was about to begin, and there would be no peace in the aftermath of Sherwani's death. But this wasn't just about power, it was about survival. Sherwani's death might have marked the end of his reign, but it wasn't the end of the war. Melbourne's organized crime problem, already one of the most pervasive and deadly in the world, wasn't going to fade with Sherwani's passing. Far from it. The city was a battleground where the lines between law and lawlessness had blurred for decades. In this world, new players rose, only to fall. Gangs formed and shattered, alliances flipped, and anyone who dared show weakness was quickly wiped out. The murder of Hawre Sherwani was just the latest chapter in a long, bloody history of gang violence. A violence that showed no signs of stopping. And as new faces emerged, so did the old fears. Who would betray whom next? Who would be the next target of vengeance? Melbourne streets, already soaked in blood, would likely see more of it in the days and weeks to come. But who would be next? Could anyone take down the giants that still roamed these streets? Or was the cycle of revenge a never-ending loop, one that consumed everyone, regardless of who was in charge? As the investigation into Sherwani's murder continues, with no real breakthroughs in sight, the underworld prepares for the inevitable. It's only a matter of time before the next act of violence erupts. Who holds the power in Melbourne now? Who will rise in Sherwani's place, and how far will they go to keep it? The end of one chapter only means the beginning of another. New names, new blood, and new alliances will shift the power dynamic. But the violence? That will remain the same. It's a war with no end. Are we witnessing the last of Melbourne's bloodiest days? Or has Sherwani's death sparked the opening of an even more violent chapter in the city's history? The answers? They're still out there, and someone is already planning the next move. The mystery surrounding the murder of Hawre Sherwani continues to haunt Melbourne's underworld. Every new twist, every new rumor, leaves us with more questions than answers. Was Sherwani truly the victim of a revenge plot? Or was his death simply part of a larger power struggle? A Game of Thrones in the underworld where no one is ever safe? Who was really behind the hit? Was it a rival gang? A debt that needed to be settled? Or was it something even more dangerous? Someone we haven't even considered yet? And as for justice, will those responsible ever face the consequences of their actions? Or is this another case where the truth is buried beneath layers of lies, fear, and silence? Let us know what you think in the comments. Who do you believe was behind the murder of Hawre Sherwani? Do you think the truth will ever come to light? Your opinions and insights are invaluable. This case isn't over, and neither is the investigation. If you've been hooked by the twists, the turns, and the shocking reality of Melbourne's gangland violence, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to keep up with all our latest true crime documentaries. Here at the Criminal Files, we dig deep into the heart of the world's most infamous criminal cases, bringing you the stories that matter, the ones you won't hear anywhere else. And stay tuned. Next week, we'll bring you the story of another shocking underworld mystery that will leave you on the edge of your seat. Could a high-profile assassination be part of a larger scheme of corruption and power plays? Or was it the work of a single, deadly individual? Only time will tell. Make sure you don't miss out, subscribe to the Criminal Files channel, and join us on this journey into the dark, mysterious world of crime that never sleeps. Until next time, stay safe, stay alert, and remember, truth is often stranger than fiction.